My name was Han Seo-jun. I died in Seoul on the day when the city was especially gray. Wet asphalt, the smell of gasoline, pain in my chest, and the stupid thought that one more step and everything will pass. It did not pass. The darkness was not soft. It tore me away like ice underfoot and threw me into a body that did not even know how to cry properly. I opened my eyes and saw a fur ceiling, smoke from the hearth, rough beams, and the face of a woman who was looking at me as if she expected me to die right now. I was a child, not metaphorically. A real infant of about 2 years old if judged by local standards. And the world around me was not the earth of the 21st century, but a northern land where winter was not just a season, but a law, a religion, and a sentence. Later I learned that this was the Hravenheim tribe, a small, broken Viking clan on the edge of a fjord, where every second house stood half empty, and almost all the adults who had survived the last war and plague were women. The men had either died or gone to sea and never returned, or lay under stone mounds on the cold slope. It was there that I first understood. I had not simply been reincarnated. I had fallen into a meat grinder. The tribe into which fate had thrown me was too weak to stand on its own. From the south, trading clans pressed on us. From the north, hunger, and from the eastern coast, foreign war bands hunting for slaves and fur. We had no strong jarl, no great sword, not even enough men to stand as a wall in a shield formation. But we had women who did not know how to surrender. And that turned out to be more important than anything. The first to understand that something was wrong with me was Sigrid Greyhand. She was not my mother by blood, but in the tribe I was immediately handed over to her. She had the hands of a blacksmith, the gaze of a leader, and a voice capable of silencing even a drunken berserker. She took me in her arms, looked into my face, and said, "This boy is too quiet. Either he is great or he is already dead inside." I did not answer. I could not. I only looked at her. Sigrid was the widow of the previous chieftain. Her husband had died in a sea raid, her son at last year's thing, defending someone else's disputed land. After that, power in the tribe fell apart. Formerly we had an elder, but the real strength rested on the women. Widows, daughters of fallen warriors, craftswomen, healers, and those who could hold an axe. I was carried through the longhouse where smoke hung under the roof like a foreign spirit. There they slept all together, ate thick stew, repaired nets, sewed cloaks, sharpened knives, and braided ropes. And all of this under the constant expectation of disaster. There was no peace here. Even laughter here was survival. I quickly understood that the word weak here meant not only a lack of strength, but also a lack of respect. A weak tribe is not a tribe, but prey. And I did not want to be prey. I was Korean only by memory. With every day, the new life soldered itself into me like cold into bone. I began to understand the language, began to distinguish clan signs, learned that a boy here cannot simply be saved. First the world breaks him, and then the world decides whether he is worthy of becoming a man. And then I thought for the first time, if I want to survive, I will have to become a jarl. Not an ordinary one, not a temporary one, not a figurehead, but the one whom enemies fear, his own people listen to, and skalds remember. My first real memory of the tribe was the day of the thing. A thing is not just a gathering. It is a place where law meets honor, where disputes are decided before everyone, where words become weapons no worse than an axe. People do not come to a thing for democracy, as they would say in another world. People come to a thing to show who has the right to speak on behalf of people. I stood aside, wrapped in a woolen cloak, and watched the women of Hravenheim argue with a gray-haired old man named Haldor Stone Tongue. He was one of those men who still remembered how strong the tribe had once been. Now, however, he resembled the shadow of a jarl, more than the jarl himself. He stubbornly demanded that the remaining silver be spent on buying salt and iron, not on foreign schemes. "We need thrift," he said, "not dreams." Sigrid answered him without shouting, but in such a way that the air seemed to become thinner. "If you do not feed the children, you will have nothing to save." People fell silent. Even the wind became quieter for a moment. Then a foreign envoy spoke. A merchant from a neighboring clan, smiling, thick-bearded, with a ring on his hand and a shadow of greed in his eyes. He offered protection and a trade alliance. The price was simple: our harbor, part of the furs, part of the fish, and the right for their people to walk through our lands. This was not an alliance. It was slow absorption. I was then too small to interfere, but I understood the main thing. Weak tribes are not killed with a sword. They are bought with debt, fear, and promises. After the thing, the tribe gathered for a feast, which they called not simply a meal, but something like a sacred feast with oaths. They raised cups, remembered the dead, and the elders spoke words on which future loyalty depended. It was very similar to an ancient rite where at the feast, oath, honor, and memory tied people to the legacy of the dead. Sigrid placed a horn of mead before herself and said, "Let the dead hear. We will not give up the fjord." Then everyone repeated after her. And I, sitting at the edge of the table, realized for the first time that in this world, an oath is not an ornament of speech. It is something that can pull you out of the future or drown you. A child here is not given a name immediately. First they see whether he survives his first winter, then whether he can hold a spoon without crying, then whether he is afraid of blood. But with me it happened differently. One day when I was about 5, an old vulva came to the tribe, a woman seer. She was brought to the hearth, given meat, mead, and a warm place. She looked at me for a long time, then at Sigrid, then suddenly grinned with her toothless mouth. This boy has the eyes of a wolf who does not yet know that he is in a cage. Sigrid tensed. "What do you see?" The vulva tapped the air with a bony finger. "He is not from this world, but his fate is already walking along our roads. He will be like lightning in a winter storm. If you let him rot, he will kill you from within. If you give him a path, he will become the one who raises your house above all enemies." After that, she pulled a small bone covered in carving from her bag, threw it into the fire, and whispered something about the Norns, about the threads of fate, and about the path already being woven, but not to the end. That night, Sigrid gave me a new name. "Ragnar," she said. The name was not accidental. It sounded like a warning, like a challenge. I accepted it because I understood. Han Seo-jun had died. Only a child remained who would either have to burn out or become a monster worthy of this world. I was not born a great swordsman. A child's body was weak, my hands trembled, my back grew tired after several blows, and any adult could knock me down with one palm. But the memory of my past life gave me not strength but thinking. I saw combat as a system. The Vikings around me fought as was proper for their world, fiercely, directly, heavily, shield to shield, axe to axe. Raid, clash, finishing blow. But I quickly understood that the strength of a tribe is not in copying the strong. Strength is in doing what the enemy does not expect. I began by begging from the forge fragments of chains, old bone plates, spare pieces of leather and horn. From this I created strange equipment for a child. The lightest leather breastplate, flexible bracers, short throwing stakes with weighted tips, which I fastened to my wrists with straps. My body had to move not like a wall, but like a blade in the shadows, but that was only part of it. In battle, I did not want to be either a berserker or a classic shield bearer. I invented my own style, the ice circle. The essence was not to go head-on, but to force the enemy to lose tempo. I worked with short steps, sharp turns of the body, deceptive shoulders, throws at the lower level. I used snow, mud, narrow passages, the sides of boats, hooks, ropes, everything that turned the battlefield into a trap. Against several enemies, I led them along an arc, pulled one out of formation, broke the rhythm, forced the others to make mistakes. At first, the elders laughed, then they stopped. Because I very quickly understood, in the north, victory comes not to the fiercest, but to the one who knows how to make someone else's fury useless. And yet this was not enough. To survive, I needed strength. Real strength. The first real battle happened on the shore when I was 8. Holm raiders came upon us, a foreign detachment from the southern coast, about 24 men, well-armed and confident that they would find only widows and children in Provenheim. They were mistaken in only one thing. Our widows were no worse than warriors, and the children already knew how to hate. When the watch horn sounded the alarm, I was by the boat shed. Sigrid snatched up an axe and shouted, "To the shields!" The women ran to the shore so fast as if Thor himself were driving them on. An old woman with a knife in her teeth. A craftswoman with a spear as long as a centerboard. A shield maiden with a heavy round shield. This was not a parade. This was despair that had learned to form ranks. I took my first real weapon, a short knife and a throwing stake with a stone tip. The raiders came in a wedge, counting on breaking our weak line. Their captain shouted, waving his sword, and was sure that everything would end now. But when he saw women with battle faces running out of the huts, he even faltered for a moment. And I used that moment. I did not rush into the center. I moved to the side, slid over the wet snow, threw the stake into the belt of the shield man on the left. He opened the formation, instinctively jerked, and the formation cracked. Sigrid struck one on the head from above. Another woman drove a spear under the ribs of a second, and I, almost childishly small, crawled between legs, slit the tendon of a third, and rolled out from under an axe blow. The raiders began to murmur anxiously for the first time. They did not understand who I was. Too small, too fast, too inconvenient. Laughter quickly turned into anger. One of them, a huge red-haired man, rushed at me, thinking he would crush me with one hand. I let him think that. At the last second, I moved aside, tripped his leg, and struck him in the throat with the stake. Not fatally, but enough for him to choke on air and fall. And then Sigrid began to sing a battle chant. It was not just a cry. It was an old ritual of raising the spirit before battle, when voices joined the rhythm of blood. Something like ancient northern warrior songs where shared resolve turns fear into strength. The women took up the chant, and the shore exploded. The battle became like a mad dance. Axes, splashes of water, wheezing, the ringing of iron, screams, retreat, another charge. I ran between the legs of adults, cut tendons, threw stones into eyes, rammed people into each other, picked up others' weapons, and immediately handed them to whoever was closer. I was not trying to become a hero. I was trying to make every step of the enemy cost him pain. When it was all over, bodies and broken shields lay on the shore and the snow was red by the water. I stood trembling from exhaustion and for the first time saw in Sigrid's eyes not pity for me as a child, but respect. "You fight like a beast that thinks," she said. "Is that bad?" I asked. She touched my forehead, smeared with someone else's blood. "It is dangerous. For everyone nearby." That was when I understood. My style had already been born. I was not a copy of someone else's warrior. I was something else. But one style was not enough. If everything had been limited only to cunning, sooner or later I would have been crushed by the stronger. So I had to grow. Become someone who could not be underestimated. Then I began to train the way no one trains. In the morning, running on ice until breathing turned into pain. Then, blows against a post wrapped in wet leather. Then, work with sacks of sand that I had to drag across the yard without losing balance. After that, throwing stakes at moving targets. At night, I studied old sagas, retellings of heroes, drawings on horns, signs on stones. I did not want simply to be strong. I wanted to understand how the northern world thinks. Why is a Jarl strong? Not only because he knows how to cut, but because he is feared, respected, listened to, and followed. A Jarl is not just a warrior. He is a center of attraction. A military leader, master of the feast, patron of the warband, a man who knows how to keep his word and give generously. Therefore, to survive, I had to not only wield a blade, I had to learn. To lead people. To give them spoils. To bear responsibility for their death. To keep an oath before the thing. And, if the hour comes, to be able to die in such a way that your name becomes a weapon. At 8, this seemed like madness to me. At 10, a task. At 12, fate. The turning point was the death of old Haldor. He died not in battle, but in bed, which for the Viking world looked almost like defeat too, but the tribe still arranged an honorable rite for him. His body was placed on an old boat beside him, an axe, a bowl, a ring, several coins, a knife, and a woolen cloak. Then the boat was set on fire at low tide. Smoke rose into the sky and became a black trail over the fjord. It was one of the most recognizable northern burial rituals, a ship or boat as a path to the other world, together with gifts corresponding to the status of the deceased. I stood among the women and watched as the fire devoured the wood. Sigrid whispered, "He was a difficult old man." "Yes," I said. "But he knew what duty was." I nodded. Then the vulva threw a pinch of herbs into the fire and said that the smoke was rising correctly. People answered with silence. After that, everyone raised horns and drank to the memory of the dead man. It was not just mourning. It was a transition of power. It was on that day that Sigrid first said aloud, "Someday Ragnar will take the place of Jarl." Many around us smirked because I was far too young, but there was no longer that light condescension in their laughter that there had been before. because by that time I had managed to win several minor skirmishes, drag home 3 captives, return a stolen sack of salt, and save from frost a child who had been forgotten in a distant house. I was not yet a warrior, but I was already the one who made the impossible slightly less impossible. On my 13th winter, my first true sign came to me. It happened during a ritual sacrificial feast, when the elders brought a gift to Odin and Thor, asking for victory and protection. In the northern tradition, seasonal sacrifices and rituals like Blot were a way to ask for the favor of the gods and strengthen unity. We stood by the sanctuary stone. There were traces of blood and ash on the snow. The smell of meat, smoke, and wet wool hung in the air. The vulva drew runes on the stone, then looked at me and ordered me to place my hand on the dark charred mark. "You want strength?" she said. "But strength loves a price." I placed my palm down, and in that same instant the world seemed to split. I saw not a vision in the usual sense, but as if 2 worlds had been overlaid. Images rose before me: a black wolf on ice, a ship in fire, a shield split in 2, and a huge pillar of light reaching into the sky. Then something clicked inside me and I felt a new sensation appear in my muscles. Not brute strength, but control. From that day, my style changed. I stopped simply slipping out from under a blow. Now I began to feel the rhythm of battle in advance. Not as magic, but as a super sensitive understanding of tempo, where the opponent would put his weight, when he would decide to lunge forward, at what moment his shield would open slightly. It did not make me a sorcerer, it made me a hunter. Old warriors would say that I hear the hugger of the enemy. Modern ones, that my reaction is too good. I did not care. The main thing was that after this, for the first time, I could fight adults not only through deception but also as equals in a short exchange. And then I understood. My path to Jarl could no longer be stopped by ordinary strength. When I turned 15, a disaster more serious than the previous ones fell upon us. From the south came a detachment of mercenaries hired by neighboring clans. They intercepted the northern road along which salt, iron, and dried fish traveled. Without this, we could survive, but we could not grow. The road is the artery of the tribe, and if it is cut, a weak clan slowly dies. Sigrid gathered the warriors. The women put on chainmail, the men raised shields, the teenagers prepared spears. We were few. The enemy was better armed and rode with the confidence of those who considered us already dead. StudySmarter.co+1. Before setting out, we performed an oath rite at the ring dedicated to the gods. For the first time, I saw people place their palm on a sacred object and publicly promise to stand until the end. It was not a spectacle. It was an oath capable of turning the fate of the whole warband. Sigrid spoke first. "I swear not to leave the fjord without protection." After her, the others. When it was my turn, everyone fell silent. I was too young for my words to decide anything, but I already understood the price of a public oath. "I swear," I said, "that if the enemy crosses the road, he will leave only through blood." Someone lowered their gaze, someone smirked. But Sigrid looked at me as if for the first time she saw not a child, but a future leader. The battle was harsh. On the snowy road, shields collided so hard that sparks flew from under the iron rims. Spears broke against chainmail. One of the mercenaries tried to break through the formation with a heavy axe, but I struck him in the knee, then in the wrist, then in the throat with a short knife. Not beautifully, not heroically, but effectively. I fought differently from everyone around me. While the others held the line, I worked like a fracture, entered a narrow crack, widened it, broke the rhythm, took the most dangerous one out of the formation, and immediately disappeared. At some point, the enemies began hunting not the shield bearers anymore, but me. And that was right, because in that moment, I was already forcing them to spend their attention not where they needed to. Sigrid noticed this and shouted, "Ragnar, left!" I dropped into the snow, rolled, rose, and saw the enemy commander right in front of me. He was a head taller than me, 20 years older, and certain that now I was finished. He had a long sword and a heavy cloak with fur. He swung down at me from above. I did not retreat. I stepped toward him. The sword whistled past. I ducked under his arm, caught his elbow, and with all my strength struck the bridge of his nose with my chin, then drove a narrow blade into the gap under his rib. He froze and fell. For a second, everything around became quiet. And then our women roared and moved forward. This was the turning point. The enemy could no longer hold the formation. We pushed them off the road, took the convoy, returned the salt, iron, and fur. And most importantly, for the first time, we showed the neighbors that Hravenheim was no longer easy prey. That night, by the fire, Sigrid silently placed before me a battle bracelet, the very sign that a warrior receives not for age, but for the right to sit among adults. "From today," she said, "you are not a child. You are the huskarl of our house." This was the first step toward becoming Jarl, and it was bloody. But even after victory, our house did not become strong instantly. Trophies had to be divided, the wounded, treated, the convoy, guarded, allies, convinced, and those who envied, restrained. And here begins what is not seen in songs. Not the battle, but the price of victory. A bad Jarl can take spoils. A good Jarl must make sure that the spoils do not tear the tribe apart from within. I began learning this earlier than I thought. I made sure that the wounded received meat first, that widows were not given the worst pieces, that young warriors received not just praise, but a share of the spoils that could be shown to their families. I myself distributed trophies as if I already sat in the high seat in the longhouse. And people noticed this. A skald who came from a distant fjord once said about me, "This boy leads people as if he knows how much each of their fears costs." It was almost true. I knew not the price of fear. I knew the price of loss. Because every time I looked at our weak clan, I saw the same thing. If we did not become stronger, we would either be swallowed or dragged off into strangers' houses. And I was not going to allow that to happen. From this point, the story of Hravenheim could no longer remain small. Next would begin the real struggle for power, with bloody rights, oaths on the ring, raids across the sea, betrayal by a neighboring clan, and Ragnar's first step toward the title he did not yet wear, but already deserved. After the victory on the road, Hravenheim lived like a stretched bowstring for another 2 weeks. The victory did not make us rich, but it changed the air in the longhouse. People began to speak louder, look directly, argue not in whispers, but aloud. Where exhaustion had once stood, something more dangerous appeared. Hope. And hope, as I quickly understood, always brings not only strength, but also envy. I sat by the hearth and sharpened a short blade when Sigrid entered the hall, with a face on which a bad decision could already be read. "What happened?" I asked. She placed a bundle of furs and a map of the coast on the table. The neighboring fjord, Skaldheim, refused to recognize our rights to the road. They say that since we took back the convoy, we must now pay them for the safety of passage. Ver, who was just repairing a strap on a shield, snorted. "Polite robbers," Sigrid nodded. And not only that, they sent a sign, a pig bone, a knitted thread, and a black stone. I raised my head. What does it mean? The old Volva, sitting in the corner beside the herbs, answered instead of her. "This is not just a threat. It is a ritual declaration of enmity. They have shown that they consider us a weak house unworthy of the gods' protection." It became quiet in the longhouse. Such things were not just an insult. This was already a challenge. And in the northern tradition, such signs had weight, because they were connected with honor, clan obligations, and public recognition of conflict. Sigrid said, "They want us to come to the thing and bow to them." I slowly stood up. "Then we will not bow." She looked at me. "Do you understand what that means?" "Yes, if we refuse, there will be war. And we may not survive it." I looked straight at her. "If we bow, we will not survive anyway, only slower." A low murmur of approval sounded in the hall. Not a cry, not joy. That rare tribal agreement when people understand. Survival is possible only through risk. The Volva threw a pinch of dry herbs into the hearth and said, "The Norns love those who do not hide their faces from fate." Then Sigrid raised a horn of mead and announced, "We prepare for a campaign. At dawn we go to Skaldheim." This was my first real campaign, not as a boy, but as a warrior who was already listened to. I was given a place in the first boat not because I was the eldest, but because they were afraid to lose sight of me. The elders did not like admitting this aloud, but after the road they understood. I do not just fight quickly, I know how to break someone else's plan. Before departure, we performed a short ritual, asking the sea not to swallow us and the gods not to turn away. Men and women touched the hilts of their weapons, someone threw a few wood chips into the water, Someone quietly spoke the name of a dead relative. It was the northern way of reminding yourself that you are not going alone. I looked at the boat, at the wet shields, at the shoulders of people, and understood. Now I had no right to make a mistake. At sea we traveled in silence. The days were gray, the sky low, as if it itself was preparing for battle. On the first evening I sat beside a girl named Hilda Song of the North. She was the best archer of the tribe, but in battle she preferred a short spear and always laughed at the wrong time, as if she considered death a bad joke. "Do you really think you can get us out of Skaldheim?" she asked. "Not I alone," I answered. "But do you believe you can?" I looked at the dark water. "I believe that if we do not try, we will be erased without a trace." Hilda smirked. "You speak like an old man. And you laugh like a person who has not yet seen true cold." She nodded toward my blade. "Still, you fight strangely. Strangely is what sometimes survives longer." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "Will you show me?" "If we survive." She laughed, and her laughter dissolved in the wind. Skaldheim turned out not to be a fortress, but a fjord settlement with a high palisade, salt warehouses, and the Jarl's longhouse on a hill. Carved charms hung over the roof, and at the gates, wolfskins stretched as a sign of strength. It was a place where they liked to show order, but in reality everything rested on fear. They were not expecting us as an army. They were expecting us as petitioners. And precisely because of that, their captain made a mistake. He came out to us with 3 men, smiling as if he had already won in advance. "Ravenheim," he said. "We have heard of your recent courage. Good that you came. I was just about to discuss your share from the road." Sigrid did not answer. I stepped forward. "Your share is where you earned it." His smile trembled slightly. "You are too small to speak on behalf of the tribe." "And you are too cowardly to speak on behalf of a Jarl?" At that moment his eyes darkened. I understood that I had struck the right place. He slowly placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. "Careful, boy." And then Hilda spoke behind my back. "Not boy. Ragnar." That name was already known. Not to everyone, but known. And that was exactly what changed the expressions on the faces at the gates. The captain looked at me, then at Sigrid, then at our boat warband, and for the first time understood. Before him was not a petition. Before him was the beginning of war. "You came in vain," he said. "No," Sigrid answered. "It was you who summoned us to another's thing in vain." The first blow came from them. The captain rushed forward, expecting that our small warband would fall apart. But in the north, what decides things is not the courage of one man, but how quickly he gathers a formation. Our shields rose as a wall, and a battle began in which there was no place for beautiful gestures. Only mud, ice, steel, breath, and pain. I worked in my style again. Did not push the enemy back, did not try to copy heavy warriors. I entered under the blow like a dancing knife between the ribs of reality. My fight was short and vicious. Step, shift, sharp cut to the wrist, strike to the knee, shoulder shove, exit from the line. When someone tried to trap me in a circle, I pulled one outside and turned his position into the mistake of the whole group. Hilda shot almost point blank. Her spear entered the gaps between shields like a bird flying into a window before a storm. Sigrid, however, was the most terrifying of all. She did not merely chop, she broke morale. Her axe found necks, elbows, knees. Each of her blows seemed final. There was no rage in her face, only the cold determination of a woman who had already lost too much and therefore could not allow herself another loss. The captain of Skaldheim saw that his first assault was choking and tried to retreat to the gates. I noticed it. And then I did what no one expected from me. I threw my short blade into the snow, grabbed someone else's shield, tossed it upward, and struck the lower edge so that it slammed into the face of the nearest opponent. He toppled over. Right after that, I flew into the gap that had formed and threw a hook on a leather strap. It caught on the gatepost. One pull, and part of the entrance became our problem. Not to close the fortress, not to win completely, but to deprive them of freedom of maneuver. That was my strength. Not to destroy the enemy at once, but to break the architecture of his battle. A minute later, the gates were no longer gates. They became a trap. Skaldheim could not withstand it. But when we entered the settlement, the second layer of war began. They set the warehouses on fire. Smoke rose over the roofs so quickly, as if the whole fjord had decided to exhale black snow. They wanted not simply to kill us with fire, they wanted to destroy the trophies, supplies, and proof of our success. Everything that could not be taken by force, they tried to turn into ash. Sigrid shouted, "To the warehouses! Save the fish and iron!" People scattered. I saw two men with torches running along the roof decking. One was already about to throw fire into sacks of dry resin. If they exploded, the whole settlement would become a sea of flame. I did not think. I jumped onto a barrel, pushed off from it, grabbed the cornice, and nearly tearing my shoulder out, climbed up. The torch struck past me. I met the second one with my forehead in his chest, knocked him off his feet, and brought him down with a knee blow to the stomach. The first tried to leave, but Hilda, appearing out of the smoke, threw her spear so precisely that it drove into his thigh and pinned him to the decking. "Alive?" she shouted. "For now, yes," I roared. "Excellent. There will be someone to interrogate." It was terrifying and funny at the same time. We put out part of the fire with snow, part with wet cloaks, part simply by pulling people out of panic. In the chaos, I noticed that Skaldheim was no longer thinking about victory. It was thinking about saving face. And that meant it would soon try to run to its Jarl and accuse us of a raid. And then a thought came to me. We do not need just a fight. We need a thing at which their lie will be cut open before everyone. The next day, we seized their thing ground. Not completely, but enough for everyone to understand. Hravenheim was not the victim here. We entered the circle where disputes were usually decided and placed our sign beside their stone. Sigrid demanded a public examination of the conflict. The Skaldheim Jarl could not refuse. Too many people had seen the night battle, and the burned warehouses could no longer be hidden. And there we stood on the icy ground, surrounded by people. The Skaldheim Jarl turned out not to be a young warrior, but a heavy, bulky man named Bjorn Fong of the Blizzard. He had a beard the color of old fur and eyes in which lived not courage, but the habit of pressing down. He immediately understood who I was and looked at me longer than at Sigrid. "Boy," he said, "you dream too loudly." I answered without smiling, "And you understood too late that your fjord can no longer intimidate ours." He narrowed his eyes. "Have you come to ask for peace?" "No," I said. "We have come to demand a thing." A murmur spread across the ground. The elders began exchanging remarks, and then the Volva stepped forward with an iron ring in her hands. She placed it on the stone and said, "Whoever fears the truth fears the oath. Whoever fears the oath has already lost." It was almost a sacred declaration. Oaths among northern peoples were not just words. They secured honor, fate, and social order. To break them meant to put one's very reputation and even life's fate under attack. Sigrid placed her hand on the ring. "I swear before everyone that Skaldheim was the first to burn our warehouses and the first to break the peace." Bjorn laughed. "That is a lie." Then I stepped forward. "Then why were your people running across the roof with torches?" Bjorn fell silent. And at that moment, one of the captured arsonists we had taken last night could not hold out and confirmed everything. He tried to wriggle out, but fear of the crowd proved stronger than fear of the Jarl. Bjorn turned pale. Few things strike a leader as hard as public exposure before the thing. Now he was obliged either to admit guilt or rush into a fight right in front of everyone. Bjorn drew his sword and charged forward. That was his way of saving face. One blow. And he hoped to turn the entire thing into chaos where truth would lose its meaning. But I was already waiting for this. I stepped not backward but sideways and did what I had learned for years. I did not block the heavy blow, but forced it to pass by the target. First, a sharp shoulder slip, then a cut to the wrist. Next, a strike with the hilt under the jaw. He was too massive to move quickly. I was too light to meet him head-on. And here, for the first time, the difference between me and an ordinary warrior became visible to everyone. I did not try to win with strength. I used tempo, distance, angle, and rhythm against his anger. When Bjorn thought I was trapped, I was already leaving it. When he wanted to crush me with mass, I turned his weight into weakness. The crowd began to murmur. Sigrid no longer watched the duel as a dispute. She watched it as a test of fate. Bjorn fell into a rage, and that became his mistake. I let his strike aside, and using the fact that his body opened up, threw a chain hook from my belt at him. The hook caught the strap of his armor, one pull, and he lost balance. My next step struck his supporting leg. He collapsed onto one knee. I stopped half a step away. Dead silence hung over the square. A boy who was not even 16 by local standards stood over the Jarl of another fjord. He could finish him? He did not. Bjorn raised his head and saw it. "Why?" he rasped. I answered evenly. "Because I came for truth, not for cheap glory. It was more dangerous than any blow. Because at a thing, people remember not only strength, they remember who can control himself after victory." Bjorn did not retreat immediately, but he retreated. He was forced to admit part of his guilt. Not fully, he was too proud, but enough for Skaldheim to no longer openly demand tribute from our road. The people on the ground heard this, and the northern world lives not only by the sword, but also by publicly fixed shame. When the thing ended, several elder men and women from neighboring settlements approached me. They did not call me Jarl, not yet. But in their eyes, there was already something that I had not received before. Recognition. That evening, Sigrid took me by the shoulder and said, "Do you understand what happened?" I looked at the thing stone, still holding the trace of our oath. We did not lose face. Not only that. Then what? She looked very attentively. You won for the first time not as a son of the tribe. You won as the one who can lead it. I did not answer because there was too much in my chest. That night, the tribe's skald composed the first short song about me. Not a great one yet. Only a line that Ragnar walks through the snow, and the trail behind him does not disappear. For someone else, it was a trifle. For me, the beginning of a name. But the higher my fame rose, the more clearly I saw the main thing. Hravenheim was still not saved. Yes, we had won the road. Yes, we had forced the neighbors to recognize our strength. Yes, people had already stopped looking at the tribe as doomed. But a Jarl is not the one who won once. A Jarl is the one who can hold people when the enemy comes again. And the enemy will come. I felt it as clearly as the approach of a storm by the smell of salt in the air. That was why I began changing not only combat, but the very structure of our house. I proposed dividing the warband into small detachments, taught women not merely to hold shields, but to build a defensive line of crossing angles, created a system of signals from horns, stones, and colored ribbons on masts, ordered spare spears to be made lighter and longer, so they could not only thrust, but also hook the enemy in the mud. At first, people did not understand. Then they got used to it. Then they began to believe. Sigrid once said in the hall by the fire, "This boy has the head of a Jarl, not a child." I answered, "Then give me a few more years and I will prove it to everyone." She looked at me for a long time. "Not to everyone," she finally said. "First to yourself." And that was the most correct advice I had received since my reincarnation. In winter, the sea changes as if it itself becomes the enemy. Ice covers the edge of the water. The wind cuts the face until it bleeds, and the waves strike the rocks with such a sound as if something huge and evil below is trying to crawl out. It was in such a winter that news came to our fjord. On the southern shore, a foreign Jarl with a warband had appeared, one who had already devastated 2 small settlements and was now moving along the coastal fjords, gathering spoils and slaves. His name was Hrodwin Iron Dog. People spoke little of him and with hatred. He was not a madman. He was worse, a calculating predator who knew where the weak had cracks. His people did not burn everything in sight. They took only what was needed: iron, women, children, grain, boats. They left living witnesses behind because fear, once released on the wind, works longer than fire. When Sigrid heard this name for the first time in a long time, she said nothing. She simply took off her glove and placed her palm on the table. "He is coming to us, Yarga," the vulva said. "How do you know?" I asked. The old woman looked into the smoke of the hearth. Because people like that are not satisfied with spoils, they need a symbol. And a weak tribe is a convenient symbol. I nodded. There it is. So everything we had built had already been noticed. We gathered the council, not at the thing, but in the longhouse. This was no longer an ordinary argument. This was a conversation about whether the tribe would survive the next moon. Thick smoke stood inside. Meat hissed on the spit, but no one ate. Even the children felt it. Right now, they were deciding not order, but the future. Sigrid spoke first. "Our fjord is too narrow to withstand a direct assault. If Hrodwin enters the bay, He will land people on both shores at once. Ver jabbed a finger at the map. Then we will not let him enter. How? Someone asked. Sigrid turned to me. Ragnar. I immediately understood that this would be that very conversation, after which it would no longer be possible to hide behind a child's age. She said, "You know how to break formation. You know how to lead small groups. You know how to think quickly in battle. We need not only a detachment standing as a wall, we need a man who will pull the battle to where the enemy will not be able to deploy." Everyone looked at me, and I said, "The narrow bay by the western rocks." The elders fell silent. I continued, "If we allow them to land on the central shore, they will cut us in half. But if we lure the first boats into the narrow passage between the stones and the shore ice, they will not be able to deploy their formations. We will strike from above, from the rocks, from the side, from the water, and we will not let them form shields." Ver smirked. "The boy wants to set a trap at sea." "Not a boy," Hilda corrected. "He is right." Sigrid nodded. "Then it is decided. We prepare an ambush." Preparing for battle was more terrifying than the battle itself, because while the sword has not been raised, you have time to think. And thinking on the eve of death is the worst torture. We dragged stones onto the western rocks, reinforced rope trip lines, cleared the passage between two narrow protrusions, camouflaged sharp stakes with snow and ice. The women sewed warm cloaks, checked spears, tarred shields. The vulva walked among the people and handed out small bundles of herbs. Not magic in the fairy tale sense, but ritual protection, a blessing, and a way to hold the spirit. Viking communities often connected preparation for war with rituals, songs, sacrificial pleas, and signs of fate. I did not sit still either. I came up with my most risky technique. If we could not stop the first wave, then we would have to destroy the center of their formation. For that, I needed light hooks, ropes, 4 short stakes, and 2 pre-weakened sections of ice near the shore. The idea was insane. At the right moment, I had to break the enemy's balance, make part of the people fall through on the ice floe, and turn the battle into chaos. Hilda, seeing the drawing, was silent for a long time. "Do you even know how to live normally?" she finally asked. "No." "That is what I thought." Then she suddenly smiled. "But if this works, I will drink to you so much that even Thor would condemn it." "If this work," I said, "I will drink with you myself." She looked at me a little longer than usual and turned her gaze away. And it was then that I understood. People were beginning to see in me not only a warrior, but also the center of the future. That was more frightening than any sword. On the 3rd day, we saw their sails, not 1, not 3. 5 boats and a large keel with a high stern decorated with a dog's head. Beautiful, deliberately predatory. Hrodwin was not hiding. He wanted to be seen, so that his very appearance would break the spirit even before the battle. Sigrid raised her hand. "To positions." People spread out among the rocks. The smoke from our hearths had been extinguished, the fires hidden, the shields removed from open places. Only the wind, the rocks, and the mist over the water remained. When the first boat entered the passage, I heard everything in my chest tighten. The irreversible moment. Hrodwin moved confidently. His people laughed, one even sang. They were ready for an easy victory. That was exactly why I did not wait until they began unloading completely. I gave the signal. 3 ropes at once yanked the shield walls that had been set up in advance. They collapsed onto the edge of the passage and forced the first boat to shift. Stones poured down from above. Hilda flew out from behind the rock and drove a spear straight into the shoulder of the front rower. The women on the left bank struck simultaneously like one enormous hand. Hrodwin instantly understood that he had fallen into a trap. But it was too late. The battle turned into a nightmare. Hrodwin's men tried to form shields, but the narrow passage broke their density. They could not turn around, could not build a full wall, could not even land properly. We struck from above, threw harpoons, hooked shields with hooks, and dragged people into the water. I jumped onto the edge of a boat as if my body were lighter than fear itself. One of the enemies swung an axe at me. I put up a shield, but not to block, to slide. The blow slipped off, the axe sank into the wood, and I was already under his arm, driving a short blade into the joint under the armpit. Another tried to hold me by the cloak. I sharply pulled the strap on my wrist and my weighted stake flew out of it. The blow landed on his nose. blood splashed straight onto the ice. At that time, Sigrid was cutting down people as if she were not a person, but a winter execution. She did not waste a single movement. Every step of hers was weighty, every swing final. Several of Hrodwin's men could not withstand her assault and retreated toward the water, where our spears immediately finished them off. But Hrodwin himself was already coming toward me. He was enormous, not just strong. Heavy like a battle pillar. He wore thick chainmail, a leather-trimmed helmet, and a short sword with a broad blade. He did not run. He moved like a hunter who had already chosen his prey. "So you are that pup?" he growled. "And you are that dog who forgot he can drown?" I answered. His eyes flared. He struck first. I moved aside, feeling the air whistle where my head had been a second earlier. The next blow came diagonally, heavy, smashing, murderous. I did not take it. I simply shifted downward, slid over the wet ice, and struck him in the ankle with my wedge. Not fatally, but enough to knock off his center of gravity. Hrodwin roared and came at me with such force that the snow cracked under his feet. And then my plan worked. I retreated exactly to where the ice had been weakened in advance. He stepped after me, too confidently. Under the heavy weight, the crack spread instantly. First one, then another. Hrodwin managed to notice it only when the edge of the ice gave way, and his leg went into the cold water. He swung his arms, trying to hold on. I did not give him that chance. A rope hook struck him in the shoulder, then a second hard in the chest. Two of ours pulled sharply, and he lost his balance. Then a stone flew down from above and hit his helmet. He staggered, and I crashed into him with my whole body. Not like a strong man, like a wedge that must not stop. We collapsed into the water and ice at the same time. The cold struck so hard that I almost went blind. The water dug into my lungs like a knife. But I managed to surface, grabbed the edge of the ice, pulled myself back out, and saw Hrodwin breathing heavily, already trying to climb out. He was strong, very strong, and that was exactly why I had to do what I did not want to do. I took from my belt the last short blade, which I had kept as a spare, and struck not at the throat, not at the heart, but at the armor strap near the very stomach. The chainmail slipped off, a gap opened beneath it, and I drove the blade there. Hrodwin froze. The sea thundered around us, people shouted, shields clashed, but in that second there was silence between us. He slowly looked down, then at me. "You are not just a child," he rasped. I did not answer. He fell to his knees straight into the icy water, and then his warband faltered. When a leader falls, people stop believing in invincibility, and that is sometimes more terrifying than death. Victory cost us dearly. We lost 3 people killed, 6 were badly wounded, several more suffered frostbite and cuts. But Hrodwin retreated. His people took the bodies and left, not even trying to save face. Their dog Jarl died by our rocks, and this spread along the coast faster than the wind. In the evening, all of Hravenheim gathered in the Longhouse. Not for celebration, for recognition. The spoils were placed on the table. Iron, several swords, hides, silver, a foreign fang as a sign of victory over a foreign leader. The vulva threw herbs into the fire. The women raised their horns. The elder warriors were silent, as those who had already understood do. A new center of gravity had appeared in the tribe. Sigrid rose and said, "Today Ragnar not only saved the bay, he showed that he can lead people to victory, not only cut down the enemy." A rumble passed through the hall. She raised her hand, and everyone fell silent. "We do not have an extra Jarl, but we have someone who already carries more than a child should. If anyone thinks I am lying, let them say it now." No one said anything. Then the vulva approached the hearth, took a carved wooden plate, and placed it before me. "This is the sign of the house," she said. "Not a title, not yet, but the memory of the clan." Then she burned the runes of my name onto it. At that very moment I understood. The path to Jarl was no longer theory. It had become reality. But it is precisely after a great victory that the most dangerous time comes. Because now people expect from you not a miracle, but continuation. They already look at you as the one who can decide what will happen next. And if you do not meet the expectation, disappointment kills faster than an arrow. A few days after the battle, Hilda came to me. Her face was hard. "There is a problem." "What kind?" "On the eastern shore, they found wreckage of a foreign boat. And not just a foreign one. There were marks on the side that I have seen only from one clan." "Which one?" She was silent for a moment. Our former ally. I raised my head. Are you sure? Yes, but there is something even worse. What? With them was an envoy whom we had considered dead since last autumn. I slowly stood up. Betrayal is not just a new enemy. It is an enemy who knows where your home is. And then I understood. The battle for Hravenheim was not over yet. It had only reached the most terrifying level, because now against us would be not only external Jarls and raiders, but also those who had once sat at the same fire with us. And that means the next blow will come from within. After the victory over Hrodwyn, things should have become easier in Hravenheim, but they became worse. It is always like that. When the enemy retreats outside, fear, envy, and old grievances begin to sound louder inside the tribe. People who had been silent yesterday spoke today. Those who had not noticed me before began to look too intently. And in those looks there was not only respect, there was also what I hated most of all, the expectation of my fall. StudySmarter.co+1. The skald who sat by the hearth was already singing short lines about me. The women spoke my name not as the name of a child, but as the name of a person capable of returning the future to the tribe. The elders had not yet called me Jarl, but that word was already hanging in the air, and the closer it crept, the more dangerous the silence between people became. Then the first strange disappearance happened. Einar Salt disappeared, one of our scouts. An uneven man with a difficult character, but useful. He knew the trails on the eastern shore, could read tracks, and could find a boat by its shadow on the water. He had not been seen for 2 days. Then his cloak was found by the stones, and beside it, tracks of foreign boots. Sigrid immediately called a council. It was stuffy in the longhouse. Smoke pressed against the black beams, meat boiled in the cauldron, but no one ate. People already understood. This was not just a disappearance. This was the first knot of a new disaster. He was taken, Hilda said. Or he left on his own, one of the old men grumbled. Sigrid slammed her palm on the table. Do not dare say foolish things when we have Hrodwyn's blood on our hands and burned tracks on the eastern shore. She looked at me. Ragnar, what do you think? I was silent for a moment. I wanted to say that this was an external matter, but I already felt... No, not only external, someone was checking our weak points too carefully. First the supplies, then the arson, now the disappearance of a scout. This is a chain, not coincidence. It is a spy, I said. And not ours. The Völva, sitting in the shadows, slowly raised her eyes. Perhaps not just one. The silence became heavy. Soon it turned out that Einar had not simply disappeared. He had been seen at the pier in the company of a man with an expensive cloak and a foreign sign on his fibula. It was an envoy of the neighboring alliance, the very one that had earlier tried to buy our road. Now the picture was forming terribly quickly. Someone wanted to weaken Hravenheim from within by passing on information about routes, supplies, defense, and numbers. So there is a rat among us, Ver said when we were inspecting the shore. And not just one, I answered. On the ice we found not only tracks, but also small pieces of wax with a seal. Not an official one, but a personal one. A sign used for secret transfer. This was already almost evidence. Almost. But not enough for a thing. Sigrid clenched her teeth. We have a person inside the tribe who is selling us out? I nodded. Or is afraid. That does not matter. For war? No. For judgment, it matters. She looked at me very carefully, as if deciding how much Jarl there already was in me and how much boy still remained. What do you propose? I answered at once. We need a ritual test of loyalty. Public. Before everyone. The old men exchanged glances. The Völva slowly nodded. He is speaking of an oath on the ring and a feast of truth. If someone lies before everyone and under the ritual, the gods see it. And people remember afterward. It was dangerous but right. In northern traditions, a public oath had enormous weight. The thing, the feast, the ring, the name of the gods, and witnesses, all of this tied a person to the community and exposed lies. Sigrid did not agree at once, but she agreed. The feast was held that same evening, not a festive one, a testing one. In the longhouse, the tables were set so that everyone could be seen. A large iron ring was placed on the central stone. Not sacred in the religious sense, but dedicated to oaths. Torches burned on the walls, and their light made people's faces sharp, almost carved out of wood. At first they ate in silence. Then Sigrid rose and said, "Today we are not celebrating victory. Today we are looking for the one who wants to sell our fjord to foreign people." A murmur sounded in the hall. She continued, "Everyone who came here as a member of Hravenheim must touch the ring and swear that they did not pass information to the enemy. Let the one who lies fear not me. Let them fear their fate." People stood up one by one, touched the ring, and spoke the words. Someone trembled. Someone was angry. Someone spoke too quickly. But most were honest, until it was Gear the Quiet's turn. He was not the strongest warrior, not the most respected, but very useful. He helped at the warehouse, repaired nets, accompanied convoys. He was liked for his calmness. Such people always seem safe. And that is exactly why they often turn out to be more dangerous than the loud ones. Gear touched the ring and said, "I swear that I did not see foreign envoys and did not pass anything to them." I looked at him and even then noticed that his fingers clenched too tightly for a moment. Sigrid saw it too, but there was no proof. After the ritual, the feast continued. People returned to their places, but the tension did not disappear. It became even denser. It was then that the vulva asked me to go out with her to the hearth. "Do you see him?" she asked. "Geir?" "Yes." "He is lying," she nodded. "But he is not lying like a man who considers himself a villain. He is lying like a man being held by the throat. That was important, because not every traitor betrays out of greed. Some break. What do you suggest?" I asked. The vulva looked into the fire for a long time. "If he is bound by an oath or fear, he can be forced to speak through a sign. But if he is bound by blood, it will be worse." Blood? Kin? Family? Debt? Sometimes a person is bought not with silver, sometimes with those whom he cannot abandon. I understood. Gear might have hostages or children, or old dependence on the external alliance. And that meant that simple exposure was not enough. We had to pull the entire knot outside. I proposed a risky plan, not a direct interrogation, not torture, not public humiliation. We had to pretend that we were going to send a false convoy to the eastern shore. If there is a spy, he will pass on the information. If he passes it on, we will catch the channel. For this, we needed a fake warehouse record, several decoy routes, and 2 real detachments with ambushes in the forest. Sigrid was silent for a long time, listening to my plan. "If you are wrong, we will lose people," she said. "If we do not try, we will lose the tribe. You are speaking more and more harshly. Because otherwise they will cut us into pieces." She looked at me, then nodded. "Do it." This was the first decision she gave to me, not as a son of the tribe, but as a person whose word already carried weight. We began preparing immediately. The records were replaced in the warehouse. Old sacks and showy crates were placed in the boats. One cart was deliberately loaded with iron so that it looked especially valuable, and 2 silent boys who knew how to pretend to be confused were seated beside it. In reality, the cargo was supposed to go by another route. We waited, and the rat came. Only it was not Geir. At first I thought I had been mistaken, but then at night, one of the decoy workers saw a woman in a dark cloak appear at the warehouse. She was from a distant house, a quiet widow whom no one had noticed before. In appearance, ordinary. In behavior, too careful. She took a small bundle, quickly hid it under her cloak, and left. We did not grab her at once. We followed, and we came out onto the real knot. The woman led us not directly to the enemy, but to an old house beyond the bridge, where a healer had once lived. Now people gathered there who disliked Hravenheim's current strength. When we crept closer, I heard voices. Inside, they spoke about the distribution of spoils, about my influence, about how the boy is already behaving like a jarl, about how women have held power for too long, about how the old alliances must be restored. This was not just a spy circle, this was an internal party of the dissatisfied. I clenched my teeth. There it is. Outside they smiled. Inside they were building a split. Sigrid, who walked beside me, had heard enough too. Her face became absolutely stone-like. "So this is who is selling us out," she whispered. I nodded. But before we could burst in, Gear came out of the house. He was not alone. Beside him stood that same envoy of the neighboring alliance. And then everything fell into place. The widow was only a courier. The real transfer was being conducted through the house hidden beyond the bridge, where where the dissatisfied could meet without unnecessary eyes. Geir saw us first, and his face turned gray, not from malice, from horror. Sigrid stepped forward, and her voice was so quiet that it frightened more than a shout. "You betrayed us?" He opened his mouth but did not answer. Then I took a step and said, "It is not he who must answer. Let him say who is holding him by the throat." Geir trembled. The envoy, on the contrary, smiled. "You think too quickly again, boy." I looked at him and already understood. This man was used to buying weakness, not fighting it. He counted on fear, hunger, division. And that was his mistake. He had not understood that by this point, Hravenheim was no longer the house that could be quietly broken. Sigrid demanded, "To the thing." The envoy smirked. "You want a scandal?" "I want the truth," she answered. "Truth," he said, "is the luxury of the strong." And then I finally understood that this conversation would not end peacefully. He was the first to draw a knife. Not a big sword, not an axe, a small blade for dirty work. But I was already waiting for this. We burst into movement at the same time. Sigrid struck at the envoy so quickly that he barely managed to throw the knife aside. At that same moment, two more climbed out of the house, guards hidden until the last moment. The fight began in the darkness by the wall of the old house under dry branches in the cold sky. I was in my element again. Narrow space, shadows, snow, a wooden bridge nearby. I turned all of it into a weapon. One opponent rushed at me with a sword, and I deliberately took a step back so that he slipped on the ice. His leg went sideways, and I drove my elbow into his chin, then swept his knee. I met the second with a hook to the wrist, knocked out his weapon, and struck him in the throat with the hilt. Hilda dropped the third with an arrow almost point blank, but the most important thing was happening elsewhere. Geir stood trembling and looked at the envoy. And suddenly I saw that a small wooden amulet hung on his neck under his clothes. I tore it off in one movement. On the amulet were carved not our signs, names, two names, one of an adult man, one of a child. The frozen air became heavy. "Hostages?" I asked. Geir covered his face with his hands. Sigrid grabbed him by the collar and yanked him toward herself. "Who?" He began to cry. Then he whispered that his wife and younger son were being held by the neighboring alliance, and if he did not pass on information, they would be killed or sold. He did not want to betray. He simply broke. That did not make him innocent, but it made the situation far worse. Because now the enemy held not just greed, he held people. This is usually where a grand moment comes in songs. The hero declares that he will save everyone, tears doors apart, cuts down enemies, brings back the family. In reality, everything was dirtier. We could not simply rush at the allied house. There were hostages there, and any sudden move would mean their death. So we had to not only catch the spies, but also figure out how to take the people back alive. Sigrid looked at me. "What do you suggest?" I thought very quickly. "We have one chance. We pretend that we are ready for negotiations and send people there with a gift. Ours will be inside. We mix a smoke mixture into the fire at the entrance to blind the guards. At the same time, a small detachment enters from the other side by water. Not an assault. Pressure. Force them to retreat to the warehouse, and there we already pull out the hostages." Ver snorted. "This is madness." "Yes," I said, "but no worse than sitting and waiting until they are killed." Sigrid looked at me for a long time and then said very quietly, "You already think like a jarl." Those words struck harder than any sword, because they were not praise. They were recognition that there was no way back. We went there at night, not with a large force, not with war, but as a shadow that already knows where the door will crack. The smoke mixture worked. At the entrance, the guards started coughing, and at that same moment, our small group broke in through the backyard. I went first. Narrow space, wooden walls, the wheezing of people, the smell of fear, oil, and wet wool. That smell exists in every house where hostages are kept. Two met me. I did not let them raise the alarm. One collapsed with a smashed throat. I knocked the second into the corridor and slammed him into the wall so that he did not get up again. Then we found the room with the captives. Geir's wife sat in the corner, and his son, a boy of about 7, pressed himself against her as if afraid even to breathe. Seeing us, the woman at first did not believe it. Then she cried. For the first time in a long time, I felt not rage, but cold, heavy pity. "Quickly," I said, "get up." Shouts could already be heard behind us. But it was too early to leave, because on the way to the doors, the envoy himself was waiting for us. He stood with a sword and understood. If he lost now, his entire scheme would collapse. "You are too stubborn, Ragnar," he said, "and you thought for too long that fear is power." He smiled. "Power is fear. Then you lost before it even began." He rushed forward. He was a good opponent. Not a champion, but smart, fast, hard. He was used to dirty work and did not try to seem honest. He fought to defeat the enemy, not for beauty. We clashed in a narrow passage where a sword barely fit. This was my fight. Where a heavy fighter got lost, I blossomed. I led his blade downward, stepped under his arm, struck the joint, then the rib. He retreated, struck again, and this time I deliberately allowed the blade to slide along the shield to pull his body forward. The hook on my belt caught his cloak. One pull, and he lost balance. At that moment, Hilda's shout sounded in the corridor. One of the enemies was trying to go around us. Hilda had already latched onto him like a winter wolf. I did not turn around. I simply pressed the envoy harder, driving the hilt of the blade under his chin. He fell. And everything ended. We brought the hostages out alive. Gyr's wife and his son met him already on the shore, where he collapsed to his knees and sobbed the way only broken people cry. I felt neither respect nor pity for him. Only understanding. If the tribe is weak, the enemy will always find whom to break first. Sigrid said briefly, "You are no longer a scout. Your family will live under our protection, and you will atone for your guilt through service." Gyr did not argue. At the thing, we publicly showed the amulet, the seals, and the evidence of the connection with the Alliance. The name of the traitor was no longer a secret. But along with this, something else became clear to everyone. Our fjord was no longer simply at war. It was becoming visible. And that means soon, not just a neighboring threat will come. A more serious force will come. In the evening in the longhouse, the Skald stood before the fire and began a new song. This time he spoke no longer of a boy. He spoke of Ragnar, who tears apart the enemy's nets, leads people across the ice, and brings captives back from darkness. I sat at the edge of the table, listened, and understood. The title of Jarl was no longer a dream. It was a question of time and price. And the price was still growing. 9. A look into the depth. Late at night, when the house slept, the vulva came to me. She sat beside the hearth and was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Have you noticed?" "What?" "Since you appeared, your name has begun to live separately from you." I looked at her. "Is that good?" "For the future, it's yes. For you, dangerous." She nodded toward the fire. I saw the threads. The Norns are already pulling your path toward the great sanctuary. There where they choose not simply warriors, but leaders. And if you reach it, you will have to decide who you will become. A man who is loved or a man who is feared. I was silent. Then I asked, "Can one be both?" The vulva smirked. "One can, but not for long." It was a very northern answer. I sat and looked into the fire. My former life in Korea now seemed almost like a dream. There were different cities, different fears, different rules. Here, life was decided on the ice, in smoke, in a boat, and at the thing. And yet I felt more and more real precisely here. Because here my strength had a price. And here I could no longer be just a survivor. I had to become the one who survives for everyone. After Gyr's exposure, a short respite came to Hravenheim. Short, like the calm before a storm. People began to consider themselves stronger. But I knew it was an illusion. The victory over Hrodwin and the rescue of the hostages had made us visible, and a visible weak house is not just a target. It is a challenge. Now, not only neighboring Jarls, but also distant clans began sending their people, their envoys, their signs. Someone offered an alliance. Someone demanded tribute. Someone simply watched, assessing whether we were worth breaking immediately or whether it was better to wait. StudySmarter.co+1. Sigrid gathered a council by the hearth and said, "We need not just to survive. We need to become such that even those stronger than us fear us." Everyone nodded. Then she looked at me. "There is a path." I already knew what she meant. The sanctuary. She nodded. The great sanctuary of Thor. A place on a rocky island where Jarls and chieftains from the coast gathered once every 3 moons. It was not just a temple, it was a center of power where the ritual of Blot took place, a great sacrifice where oaths became law, and victories in duels determined alliances and enmities. People did not come there for prayer. They came there for power. Only strong clans could send a representative there. Weak ones could not. But if a weak house showed strength, it could return from there with allies, treaties, and a reputation worth 10 victories. "If we send someone," Sigrid said, "it must be you." Silence hung in the hall. I was not surprised. I had been waiting for this. "I am ready." Hilda smirked. "You are always ready. But the sanctuary is not a thing. There will not simply be Jarls there. There will be champions." "I know," the Velva added, "and there the gods watch more carefully. If you pass the trial, they will mark you. If not, they will forget you." It was a challenge, and I accepted it. The journey to the sanctuary took 2 weeks. 2 weeks by sea through storms, past hostile shores, and past rocks, where those whom it was better not to meet lived. We had to gather a warband, supplies, weapons, and people who would not break halfway. I chose a detachment of 16. Hilda, Ver, Sigrid, the Volva, 6 best warriors, 3 scouts, and 3 women who knew how to heal and negotiate. It was not the largest detachment, but the most balanced. Before departure, we held a small blot, a sacrificial ritual for luck on the road. The Volva cut the throat of a ram, the blood was mixed with mead, and drops were sprinkled on the ship and on our hands. Then everyone raised horns and swore to return. It was not just a ritual. It was a way to remind ourselves that ahead was not a stroll but a trial. The sea met us with cold wind and gray water. On the 3rd day, a storm began. The boat creaked, waves struck the side. Hilda hung on the yards, Ver cursed the gods, and I stood at the helm and learned to feel the ship. Because at sea, battle does not begin with a sword. It begins with the one who first sees a shadow on the horizon. On the 5th day, we encountered pirates. Not a strong clan, but a rabble of 3 boats hunting lone vessels. They saw us and decided that we were easy prey. Mistake. We did not wait for their attack. I gave the signal, and Hilda loosed the first arrow straight into the rower on the front boat. Then our spears flew into the masts. Ver and Sigrid each took an oar and began a maneuver to expose the side. The pirates had not expected resistance. They had expected fear. When their first boat started sinking, the others tried to leave, but we were already closer. I jumped onto their side with a hook in my hand, caught the gunwale, and flew into the center. 3 rushed at me at once. I did not let them bunch up. The first received a blow to the knee, the second to the wrist, the third to the throat. The rest surrendered. We took their boat and supplies. It was not a heroic battle. It was a demonstration that Hravenheim was no longer a weak house. But after that I understood. News of us was already flying ahead. We would arrive at the sanctuary not as petitioners, as those who were already expected. The sanctuary looked like the gods' strike against the rock. The island was gray, bare, with a single bay and a tall stone pillar crowned with Thor's hammer. Around it stood tents, fires, boats, banners, jarls, chieftains, their warbands. Hundreds of people, and the air smelled of salt, smoke, meat, and metal. We were not met with bread and salt. We were met with curiosity and coldness. One of the guards at the gate asked, "Hravenheim, the weak house?" Sigrid answered, "The house that drowned the iron dog." The guard narrowed his eyes. "That was you?" "Yes." He nodded and let us pass. But inside, eyes were already waiting. The first trial was the duel of champions. Not to the death, but harsh. Each Jarl sent his best warrior to show the strength of his house. The winner received the right to speak first at the thing and a place by the main hearth. The Jarls looked at me and laughed. "A child?" one asked. "Him," Sigrid answered. The laughter became louder, but when my turn came, I stepped onto the ground without a shield and with 2 short blades. The opponent was grown, heavy, with an axe and chainmail. The fight began at the signal of the horn. He went straight into attack, counting on breaking me with his mass. I did not take the blow. I moved aside, let the axe pass by, struck the wrist and immediately the back of the knee. He turned, swung again. I was already behind him and cut the armor strap. The crowd began to murmur. He roared and rushed at me. This was my moment. I took a step back, threw the hook at his leg, and pulled. He stumbled. The next blow came to the shoulder, but I had already ducked under and drove the blade into the gap under the elbow. The axe fell. I stepped back. The ground exploded with cries. The Jarls no longer laughed. The thing began the next day. The Jarls sat in a circle by the stone with the hammer. Each spoke of his affairs, alliances, enemies. When our turn came, Sigrid stood and said, "Hravenheim is no longer weak. We drowned the Iron Dog. We returned the hostages. We are ready for alliances with those who respect strength." One of the Jarls, tall, gray-haired, with a face like a wolf's, asked, "And what can you offer?" I stood without permission. "We can offer not just friendship, we can offer knowledge. New ways of fighting, new connections through the road, and those who will not break in battle." He narrowed his eyes. "The boy speaks for the house?" "The boy who defeats champions," Sigrid answered. The thing fell silent. Then the gray-haired Jarl said, "Good, we will talk." It was a breakthrough, but not the end. Because at a thing there are always not only allies. There are also those who see you as a threat. In the evening, a berserker approached me. Not an ordinary warrior, a real one. Wild eyes, scars across his whole face, a body like a bear's. He was from another Jarl's retinue and looked at me as if he had already decided that I was unworthy of a place among them. "You fight beautifully, hun," he said. "Beautifully? But beautiful does not survive." I did not step back. "And wild does not win." He smirked. "Want to test it?" It was a challenge, not official, personal. I nodded. "When?" "Now." The fight was not on the ground. The fight was by the rocks under the moon, where there were only the two of us in the sea. The berserker wore no shield, wore no armor, only fur and an axe. He entered berserk, a state of fury when pain leaves and strength grows. His eyes became red, his breathing heavy, his blows lightning fast. He was the most dangerous opponent I had met. He chopped as if every blow were the last. I could not move far away, the rocks and the sea squeezed the space. I had to work up close. Dodge the axe by millimeters, strike the arms, the legs, the rhythm. He did not feel pain, but he felt that I was not letting him deploy. When he began to tire, I made my move. The hook caught his fur, a pull, and he lost balance. The next blow came to the shoulder, but I was already inside and drove the blade into the joint of the thigh. He roared, but I did not let him stand up. The fight ended on the ground. I sat on his chest, squeezing his throat. "Enough?" I asked. He looked at me without malice. "Enough. You are different." I let him go. And then he said, "The Jarls fear you." "Why?" "Because you are not just a warrior. You are changing the rules." That was the most valuable lesson of that night. We returned to Hravenheim with treaties, furs, and a new reputation. But most importantly, that with the understanding, now we are not just surviving, we are becoming a force. Sigrid gathered the people and said, "Ragnar passed the sanctuary. He brought alliances. He proved that our house deserves more." Then she looked at me. "And now he is not just a warrior, he is the heir." The hall exploded. It was not a title, it was a step toward it. But winter waited ahead, and a real war.